Welcome to this demo of MediaStream. MediaStream is Activa Media's solution for solving a very common problem with TV operators, which is to integrate many different and heterogeneous metadata sources into a unified structure and relay this information to end user platforms, one, several end user platforms, or some other systems that may benefit from unified metadata, such as recommendation engines. So MediaStream sits in between these sources and targets in order to automate the process and unify, enrich, and improve the quality of the metadata handled by these TV operators. Before we dig deeper into the MediaStream's user interface, let's over the different sections of the tool. These are the sections. The first one is alerts. As I have been saying, the process of integrating, ingesting, and exporting the metadata is mostly automated and does not require any kind of human intervention. But when something wrong happens, like an integration point is no longer accessible or some metadata is missing, etc., this alert section is the way to go to understand what's going on and try to fix it. The other two sections on the upper row are import and export. These are mostly symmetrical. There's a import subsystem where the different metadata sources are integrated and configured in order to automate the process of ingesting the metadata. And there's an export subsystem where different export procedures are configured that fetch the unified data and relay in the appropriate format this data to the end user platforms. Now we go to content, and this allows me to introduce a very important concept from the point of view of MediaStream of product design, which is the radical distinction made between content and what we call event. Let me put you an example. Suppose we have the movie Terminator by James Cameron, 1984. From the point of view of MediaStream, this content entry is immutable. It's something that we won't delete. We keep this entry forever, regardless of whether Terminator is currently being programmed or not. So, suppose, for instance, that we have Terminator aired in some linear TV channel at a particular point in time. From the point of view of MediaStream, we model this as an event that links to this unified content entry. If Terminator is available in two different windows, say on linear TV and in some external catalogs such as Amazon Prime, then there's going to be two events referring or pointing to the same unified content entry. So it is very, very important to keep in mind this distinction we make between content and events. So this is the section for content management, and for events, we have three different sections depending on the type of events. One for linear TV, for EPG events, another one for VOD, which is the internal VOD section of a customer, of a TV operator, and what we call catalogs, which are external VOD services integrated into the offer of a TV operator, like the quintessential Netflix or Amazon Prime or HBO, this kind of stuff. So we have content on one hand and three different sections for different types of events. Now the two remaining sections are contracts. Contracts is a very small section where the operator can include information having to do with contracts and licenses applying to the content being programmed on the internal VOD section. The tool double checks that the content being programmed here is actually compliant with the current licenses stored here. And then we have a section called settings, which is the regular settings section of a web app, including configuration parameters, etc. This is as well where the operator can provision new users and assign them different roles so that they can access some sections of the tool and not access some other sections, so as to support users with different types of activities. So without further ado, we can begin our journey by going to content. So as I have said already, content is immutable and is never deleted from the database of this particular deployment of MediaStream. That means that as time goes on, The database of content keeps growing and can be typically like hundreds of thousands of different content entries. So we need to have some tool in order to navigate this massive amount of information. This search bar works pretty much like a Google search bar, supporting also fuzzy search, etc. So let's begin by looking for Terminator, the movie. And if we click Terminator, MediaStream says that in this particular deployment, we have 67 results. And the first one is precisely Terminator, the movie from 1984. Hovering over the entry, we can see a glimpse of the information we have stored about Terminator. And if we click, we access the full content entry here. So what you are seeing over here are the regular, typical metadata fields supported by MediaStream, like title, the original title, the year of production, synopsis, and so on and so forth. If there is a case where a customer needs some specific metadata field that is not covered here, it is very easy to extend the data model so as to support it. But our experience tells us that this is usually not the case. The current metadata field set that we're supporting is more than enough to handle all the situations that our customers come up with. Apart from textual metadata, we have also information about the cast and crew, the people who directed or scripted the movie or acted in the movie. If we scroll over here, we probably are going to see here, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger has his own entry with metadata fields such as the full name, bio, date of birth, images, this kind of stuff. Okay. Uh, Let me bring your attention to this ID over here. This is the unique ID assigned by MediaStream to this content entry. So, whenever an event refers in the past or in the future refers to Terminator the movie, it's going to be using this unique ID so that the operator can rest assured that different events are actually referring to the same content entry as identified by this. We also have a possibility, and we in fact keep other external IDs from metadata providers or the IMDb ID, this kind of stuff. We can store this and we store this information and we can use it, but in terms or in order for the content to be guaranteedly assigned a unique ID, we are using our own unique ID such as this. If we scroll down past metadata field, textual metadata fields and cast and crew, we see the images we have stored for this content entry. And we are following a different approach here as opposed to textual metadata fields. Here we are not unifying all the metadata into one single view because when it comes to images, many providers are having some restrictions on when and how these images can be used by the clients, by the operators. So they are not free to use by the operator, so to say. What we are doing then is keeping the images separate by provider in separate so-called rails. And then at export time, when the data is exported, we have so-called business rules configured by the operator that basically instruct and determine which images are used in which particular contexts. So we're having the best of both worlds. We are keeping images separate in order not to run into legal issues with how we use the images, and we decide how to use these images and which images are finally going to the end user platforms by so-called business rules at export time. What you have seen here is one particular type of content. This is a movie, but we support other types of content, and most notably series. If we look for a series, a popular series such as The Big Bang Theory, for instance, we have many different entries for Big Bang Theory, many different episodes, but I want you to focus on the first one, which is labeled with this purple M. This is an entry that we call the master entry for Big Bang Theory. This entry is associated to the series as a whole, not a particular episode. If we click on this, we see that this master entry can also have textual and image metadata, and it is a way to access the different episodes that have ever been ingested into these deployments. We are not listing the full episodes list of Big Bang Theory, only those that have ever been ingested into the deployment. In this case, we have 12 different seasons, and if we expand the last season and go to the last episode, this is El Síndrome de Estocolmo. This is Spanish for Stockholm Syndrome. And this is the last episode we have here. And if we click on this, we have an entry devoted specifically to these episodes with textual metadata, actors, directors, images, and so on. Okay. We have an FT feature that we call metadata inheritance that applies to the case of a series with many episodes where some of the episodes are lacking in quality because there are some missing fields or the images are not enough or whatever. This is usually the case with a series that have many episodes, like The Simpsons, for instance. So when this happens, we support this notion of metadata inheritance, by which if some field is missing, we export the corresponding fields on the master entry. This allows for some kind of fallback in order to make sure that we are providing at least something in terms of metadata. And our customers find this feature very useful. This is content, and you remember that I mentioned also events. So these are the opportunities for watching this content in some exploitation windows. If we click on linear TV, what we are seeing here are the TV or the linear TV events associated to these Stockholm Syndrome episodes. Or in other words, we can see where in linear TV is Stockholm Syndrome currently available. As it happens, we have this channel TNT HD, which is airing these particular episodes at this time from this hour to this other time. Okay, if we click on VOD, we see that this episode has been programmed in Amazon, Netflix, and HBO in the past, and is currently part of the Netflix catalog. So you are seeing how MediaStream basically works. We are unifying the content, which is identified by this unique identifier, and we relate the different events programming the content via this ID, and as seen here. Before we move into EPG, which is the first of the event-dedicated sections of MediaStream, I would like to click on this contributor tab. You remember that I was talking about the MediaStream unique ID. We also keep the IDs from metadata providers. This is the history of all the metadata providers that have contributed some information to this particular content entry. We automate the process. We have some AI in order to determine that all these providers were actually referring to the same content entry, because this is not obvious. I mean, they are not using some kind of global ID or anything like that. So we need to have some algorithm in order to determine that. When new content entry is determined to be the same as something we already have, then there's some merging of information which can also be automated. And this is a briefing of the history of what contributors made it into this particular episode. And as you see here, we retain the IDs of these metadata providers, and we can use them at export time, and we actually use them for instance, for deep link generation, which is one of the features of MediaStream. So let's move out of content and begin exploring events, or where the content is being programmed. The first event section is lineup for EPG for linear TV. So if we click on this, we get a regular grid of TV programs. Okay, this section is typically read only or pass through, because the information typically comes from metadata providers with little modification down to end user platforms. That said, we can change things here. I can change, for instance, the start time or the end time if some information is not correct. And if I save this information, the corrected information is going to be exported next time the procedure for exports is triggered. Apart, if we click, for instance, on this eye over here, we are going to the content entry for the content that is being programmed by this particular event. Another thing that I would like to mention is this so-called content tags. This is a feature that our customers love. What are those content tags? These are labels or pieces of information typically associated to access rights. Think, for instance, this content is available for mobile devices, or this is geo-blocked for this particular region, or this is available or not available for network PVR, this kind of stuff. This information typically does not come from metadata providers. It is provided by the operator itself, but MediaStream allows for merging or adding this kind of information to the regular information coming from metadata providers so that both these content tags information and, let's say, regular metadata are aggregated and exported to the end user platforms. These so-called content tags can be assigned at the contents level or the events level or for a whole channel, and the customers find it very useful to have this unified point of metadata management instead of going to the different end user platforms or external systems in order to provide this additional information. So a very useful feature, very simple technically, but our customers, as I said before, love it. I have already mentioned that we can edit things here, and we also have algorithms in place that make sure that we are not allowing any kind of overlap of events or gaps within events. Some end user platforms are very picky when it comes to accepting EPG information, and then they require that the events are perfectly aligned. We make sure that this is the case internally from MediaStream, so that the operator does not have to pay too much attention to that. If we go to another event section that of catalogs, this is from the point of view of MediaStream, this is just a way of organizing content entry in a different manner as EPG. So here, what we are seeing is different catalogs, different providers, and all of them have events pointing to some particular content entry. In these deployments, we have content providers integrated like Netflix, HBO, Fox. Filming is a Spanish OTT provider. Amazon A3 player is also Spanish. And from the point of view of MediaStream, again, this is just a list of content of events pointed out or pointing to unified content on MediaStream deployment database. If we go to Netflix, and remember that Netflix was currently programming this Big Bang Theory episodes, if we look for that, we see here that this is exactly the episode that we saw before. Now, if we go to VOD, this refers, if you remember, to the internal VOD section of the TV operator. Unlike external catalogs, where the information is basically provided by the third-party provider, so the operator does not have to add much to that, here we are dealing with the task of programming the information directly from the operator. So the editorial team or the operations team of the operator needs to actually go here and provide the information having to do with what programs, what content entries are programmed, and what the price for these content entries are, or what the different aspects of the commercial offer are. So there's a lot of work to be done here. This is the most intensive section in terms of time devoted to activities of programming of the whole tool. If we click on any of these entries, for instance, this one, we see here what information having to do with programming a content entry in the internal VOD section is about. What we have found is that this information is pretty dependent on the end user platform. So apart from some common fields such as what is the start time and the end time for availability of this content entry, the rest of the information fields are very dependent on the end user platform and on the commercial aspects of the operator itself. Things like the pricing or the categories that the content is being programmed on, this kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, what we finally do is we have a conversation with the final customer. understand what the requirements are, and then we design a specific VOD section for them with all the required fields. So we are not pretending, or we are not aspiring to have something that works for all the cases, because the differences between customers are so great. So we use this approach. We have a conversation with them and we design and customize the section particularly for them. What you are seeing here, for instance, is what some customer has for Kaltura. Okay, if we go back again to the main section for VOD, I would also like to mention the status column. This status reflects how complete the information is in order to for MediaStream to publish the information or not. So things that are checked here is all the commercial information, pricing, etc. complete? Is the metadata complete? Are there enough images for export? This kind of stuff. These rules are configured by the operator, and MediaStream basically checks them and does not publish anything unless all the checks, internal checks, are green. We also support integration with media processing. This is not part of MediaStream, but we can integrate with a media workflow manager. And in fact, Optiva Media has its own media processing workflow manager called MediaCode. We have found that metadata management and media management are typically desynchronized. They are typically carried out by different teams within the operator, and there's a lot of calls going on from one team to the other, or emails, etc., in order to make sure that both the metadata and media are kept in sync. Or, for instance, that the metadata or a program is not, a content entry is not programmed in the internal VOD section until the media itself is already available in the CDN and this kind of stuff. So from our point of view, it is best to have these both tracks in sync, and MediaStream allows the operator to do that because we can integrate with the workflow media manager, media processing workflow manager that the operator is using in order to make sure that the associated media are already available, and only when these media are available do we publish the metadata for that. So this is for VOD, and the two remaining sections that I would like to go very briefly are the import subsystem and the export subsystem. The import subsystem has this historical section where we can see recent import procedures and some statistical information about the amount of information that was ingested into the platform. And then we can go also, I'm just going to show it, I'm not going to explain this in detail, the configuration section for the imports procedures. For each metadata provider, some input procedure needs to be configured using some particular format or some particular protocol for metadata access. And we have lots and lots of different types of information configurable here, both at the technical level, like, okay, what is the FTP folder where the information is going to be deposited, or what is the URL if we are dealing with an API-based metadata provider, stuff like that. And we also have non-technical configuration aspects having to do with, okay, I have some categories from this metadata provider and I want to map those to my own category sets. So this is where I can do the mapping, or I want to filter out some of the results so that we are also only importing a subset of the whole offer from this metadata provider or this OTT provider and this kind of stuff. The amount of information here is staggering. There is many different aspects that can be configured. Good news is once everything's set up, things run automatically. You can't forget about that because the procedures for importing information are automatic, or they are so-called push imports procedures, where the information is made available by the metadata provider, typically by making some file available in some FTP folder. And we also support so-called pull imports procedures, where it is the input procedure that goes actively to the metadata provider in order to fetch the data, typically via some API. Okay, we have a number of metadata providers already integrated into the system, and in the case of OTT providers, we have integrations done for Netflix, Amazon Prime, for HBO, for Fox, and others. And due to the modular nature of MediaStream, it is very easy to integrate this with new metadata providers. And the situation can be one of two cases. Either we are already supporting the protocol that the metadata provider uses or the formats they use, like ADI or TVA, we already support those. Or if they're using their own format or their own protocol, for instance, some API, etc., then a new so-called import engine needs to be developed, and this is integrated into the deployment, and everything can be set up in a matter of days or weeks. Okay. As, and as for the end section, this is exports, which is basically symmetrical. We have an historical section for exports where we can see where the different about the recent export procedures and the information or some statistical information about what they produced, what kind of information they relayed on to end user platforms. And then we have a configuration section, again, a massive configuration section where we can define, schedule, and trigger all the export procedures that once in place are basically running in an automated fashion without any kind of human intervention. Some of our potential customers are a little surprised that we have these many different export procedures here, but they because they typically think that there's only one export point, which is the end user platform they're using. In reality, there are typically many more export points. For instance, you can have different deployments for your end user platform, the production deployment, the staging deployment, this kind of stuff. Or you can have legacy platforms and you are giving service to more than one technology for distributing your content or your service to your end users. And or there are also some other external systems that in fact consume and accept metadata like recommendation engines or some CMS for managing your website, this kind of stuff. At the end of the day, because it is so easy to integrate more and more export points into the deployment of MediaStream, our customers basically end up with tens, if not more, integration points here for exporting the metadata. The metadata is unified, it's the same for all the export points. The only thing that changes is the particular format and the sections that are exported depending on what the requirements of the operator is and the restrictions of technological restrictions of the end user platforms are. And this basically completes the demo of MediaStream. I hope you have a better understanding of what the tool is about, but of course we are at your disposal for providing you with more information or maybe digging deeper into some of the sections that you might find interesting or want to know basically more about. So thank you very much.